let's talk about corruption. From being largely absent in the development debate in previous decades, now it seems to have moved to a consensus that it matters a great deal for development. What are some of the factors that have contributed to make corruption less of a taboo subject among policymakers?
It is true, Cristina, that sometime in the late 1980s, early 1990s, there was a shift in the thinking about the role of corruption in the development process. We didn't talk then explicitly about corruption in a very direct way. We actually talked about good governance. And in thinking about the factors that have contributed to this kind of mental shift, I mean, several things come to mind. I think one of them has to do with what I would say the falling of the Berlin Wall as a symbol for the collapse of central planning, as a kind of economic strategy. What happened in the late 1980s is that all of a sudden the international financial institutions, donor countries in the industrial world, were confronted, with this huge problem of assisting these countries to make the transition to more democratic forms of governance, to put in place the basic elements of a market economy. And it was clear then that it would take more than just getting inflation right or getting the budget deficit under control, because the perception was that the reason for the collapse of central planning went well beyond simply bad macroeconomic management. It had to do fundamentally with weak institutions and with a lack of transparency, lack of accountability, and hence corruption. So that clearly was one important factor. Then we have what I think is the end of the Cold War. During the Cold War, we had this kind of ideological divide, and corruption in many parts of the world was tolerated because it was seen as a kind of a loyalty payment. We tolerated corruption in country X because they were loyal to our camp, during the time of the Cold War. But at the end of the Cold War, there was, all of a sudden, much greater unwillingness on the part of donor countries, especially, to basically accept, egregious evidence of corruption in many parts of the developing world. So that was clearly one factor. A number of kleptocrats were actually cut off from the flow of aid funds, around that time, because their loyalty was no longer necessary with the end of the Cold War. Another factor had to do, I think, with a certain kind of frustration in the development community with what was happening in Africa. The early data showed that we were making progress in reducing extreme poverty, but this was mainly focused on China. In fact, in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, you saw actually increase in the number of poor, and this, of course, raised questions about is our approach correct? Do we not, in fact, need to broaden the debate and to bring other concerns, into the development debate, of which corruption, of course, was one. Then I think that there were developments in the academic community. There was new research that highlighted the importance of institutions, the importance of education. Corruption began to be seen less as a political issue and more as an economic issue, as an issue of resource allocation. If 30% of the funds which are being provided by donor countries is disappearing into the offshore accounts of the government elite, this obviously has a huge impact on the path that the development process is going to take. So this clearly was another factor. I think that the intensification of the process of globalization was also a driving force. You know that in the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev in the mid-1980s began a process of opening up, and as Soviet citizens began to travel abroad and they began to see the reality lived in the capitalist West with their own eyes, they discovered some very painful truths. These countries had higher standards of living, and they lived, by and large, in a context of democratic forms of governance and respect for certain basic rights. And this, it seems to me, in many parts, led to an increase in the demand for openness and for transparency in government. And this was a very important factor as well in making the debate about corruption much less of a taboo subject. Also, in the 1990s, there were a large number of scandals. Presidents were forced out of office. They were forced to resign, or their reputations were tarnished, or were affected in some way in many places, in Brazil, in Venezuela, in Mexico, in Pakistan, in India, in Italy, in Colombia. This created an awareness, in civil society and in the population at large about the insidiousness of corruption. Then there were also a number of interesting developments on the legal front. In 1977, the United States approved something called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which basically made it illegal for American companies to bribe foreign officials, something that had been a widespread practice before. Now, what happened, this is really quite interesting from a historical perspective, is that many of the other members of the OECD did not have an equivalent legal instrument. And in many competitors of the United States, bribery continued to be tax deductible. It was actually seen as a cost of doing business, perfectly acceptable practice. What then happened is that many of the American companies began to lose business to their European and other OECD competitors. And of course, this led to a great deal of disquiet and discomfort, in the American business community. To cut a long story short, in 1997, under the great encouragement of the United States government, the OECD adopted anti-bribery convention. And this established an important sort of starting point in the fight against corruption. A couple of other things that come to mind was the emergence of Transparency International and the Corruption Perceptions Index. This in a very, very important way legitimized the debate about corruption and the role of corruption in development. And then finally, perhaps one could mention a speech and associated actions given by the president of the World Bank, Mr. Wolfensohn, in 1996 at the annual meeting of the IMF and the World Bank, where he spoke very explicitly about the cancer of corruption. And he mentioned what were some of the problems with corruption. He said that it diverts resources from the poor to the rich. It undermines foreign direct investment. It increases the cost of doing business for the community. It distorts the allocation of public expenditure and so on. In other words, it has a whole range of implications which in some way pervert the process of economic development. I think that these are some of the factors that come to mind in terms of what made it possible, for corruption to stop being a taboo subject and to move into the center of the debate in terms of what matters for development.